Hey everyone. Tonight we begin in a rusted transport ship groaning across the Pacific, packed with bodies and soaked in the stench of sweat, salt, and slow decay. You've heard of Nazi camps and Stalin's gulags, but the Japanese prison camps. They were cruelty without structure, punishment without reason. No ideology, just heat, hunger, and humiliation dropped like a cage over men who had already lost everything. This wasn't about extermination. It was about erasure of dignity, of sanity, of self. If peeling back the darkest corners of forgotten history helps you fall asleep, please like and subscribe. And hey, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what memory of silence still echoes in your dreams? Now take a breath, feel the dust settle on your skin, and step inside the wire, where even surrender offers no salvation. You find yourself standing on unfamiliar ground, the scent of damp earth and distant smoke clinging to the air. The world has tilted on its axis, and the very act of breathing feels different now, heavier. You remember the moment of surrender, not with a bang, but with a whisper, a slow fading of the frantic energy that had sustained you. One moment, there was the sharp crack of rifle fire, the frantic rush of adrenaline, the desperate hope of holding a line. The next, a profound stillness descends, a quiet acceptance that settles deep in your bones. You are no longer a soldier, no longer bound by the fierce pride of your uniform. That identity, once so solid, now feels like a discarded skin, left behind in the chaos. There is no fanfare, no formal declaration, just the sudden, stark realization that your world has shrunk to the space around your feet. They heard you, not with shouts, but with a quiet, unyielding pressure. A flow of bodies moving inexorably forward. You are part of a silent tide, pushed into the confines of an old colonial fort, its stone walls scarred by time and conflict. The air inside is thick, heavy with the unspoken fear of hundreds of men. You have nothing left but the clothes on your back, worn and dusty, and the faint, persistent thrum of your own heartbeat. Your pockets are empty. Your mind feels strangely hollowed out, stripped of the expectations and routines that once defined your days. The fear is there, a cold knot tightening in your throat. But it's a quiet fear, a deep-seated hum rather than a screaming alarm. It's the fear of the unknown, of the absolute uncertainty that stretches out before you like a vast, empty landscape. You look around at the faces of the men beside you, some resolute, some hollowed out, some simply blank. There is a shared understanding in their eyes, a silent recognition of this new, unwelcome reality. The sun begins its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. But the beauty feels distant, unconnected to this new world you inhabit. You listen to the quiet murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet, the occasional cough that breaks the stillness, and you wait in the fading light for whatever quiet darkness will arrive with the dawn. The walls of the fort seem to press in, not aggressively, but with a patient, unyielding presence, as if the very stone understands the deep, quiet despair that has begun to settle around you. You take a breath, and the air tastes of dust and the faint metallic tang of resignation. The fort is merely a prelude, a waiting room before the true journey begins. You are moved again, this time to the docks, where a ship awaits. They call it a transport ship, but the word feels hollow, a polite lie. as you step onto its steel deck. A sense of foreboding washes over you, cold and clear. This is not a vessel of passage, but a floating grave, its belly ready to swallow the living. The air is thick, humid, a heavy blanket that presses down on your lungs. You are pushed into the hold, a vast, dark cavern already teeming with bodies. There is no space. Not really. You stand shoulder to shoulder, pressed against the rough fabric of a stranger's uniform, the heat rising in oppressive waves. The air quickly becomes stifling, a soup of sweat, human breath, and the metallic tang of fear. The ship groans to life, a deep, mechanical sigh that vibrates through your feet, up your legs, and into your very core. You can feel the slow, deliberate pulse of the engines, a relentless rhythm that will accompany your journey into the abyss. There is no water, only the raw, burning thirst that begins to bloom in your throat, a quiet fire that spreads through your mouth and across your tongue. You lick your lips, but there is no moisture, only the dry, cracked surface. The concept of a toilet becomes a distant, laughable memory. The hold fills with the sharp, acidic scent of human waste, a constant reminder of the stripping away of dignity. Days and nights blur into an indistinguishable continuum of discomfort. You lean against the rough bulkhead, the vibration of the ship a constant tremor through your bones. Sleep comes in fragmented moments, a shallow, restless drift punctuated by the sounds of distress around you. You hear the quiet moans of men consumed by fever, the rasping coughs that signal failing lungs, the low, guttural sounds of dysentery. Each sound is a small, quiet chisel against the fragile wall of your own composure. You witness the slow, inevitable decline of those around you. A man you spoke with just yesterday, whose name you barely caught, now lies still, his breath a faint whisper, then nothing at all. Another, consumed by a raging fever, mutters incoherently, his skin burning to the touch. Their bodies are left where they fall, a quiet testament to the ship's indifference, to the overwhelming lack of space, of care, of simple humanity. You learn to step over them, a quiet, almost automatic motion, because there is no other choice. The smell of death, subtle at first, then more pronounced, begins to mingle with the other odors, a heavy, cloying scent that coats your tongue. You are a living being amongst the dying, and the line between the two seems to blur with each passing hour. You stare into the darkness, the only light the occasional faint glow from above, and you feel your own strength ebbing away, like sand through your fingers. When the ship finally grinds to a halt, and the distant sounds of land drift down into the hold, you are already half a corpse, a hollowed-out vessel, ready to be unloaded into the next stage of this quiet, unfolding nightmare. The thought of stepping onto solid ground, any ground, is a gentle, persistent hum in the back of your mind. When you are finally pushed off the ship, the ground beneath your feet feels strangely unstable, as if the earth itself is swaying. The camp unfolds before you, not with a dramatic reveal, but with a slow, creeping realization of its stark reality. It is a collection of hastily constructed barracks, long, low structures that offer little comfort. Inside, the sleeping arrangements are rudimentary at best. You are assigned a space, a small patch of rotting wood, or perhaps just the bare, damp earth. The scent of mildew and decay is pervasive, a damp, heavy smell that settles in your nostrils and never truly leaves. This is where you are meant to rest, to find solace. Instead, it becomes a place of constant, quiet torment. The darkness inside the barracks is never absolute, but it is a thick, oppressive gloom. Moonlight, when it filters through cracks in the walls or roof, casts long, skeletal shadows that dance with the movements of the men. There is no privacy, not even the illusion of it. You are always within arm's reach of another body, another breath. The sounds of the camp are a constant. Low hum the rustle of straw, the quiet moans of men in pain, the soft, rhythmic scratching that signals the presence of countless small creatures. You soon discover your companions in this quiet decay, the fleas. Tiny, persistent irritations that leap onto your skin. The lice, a creeping, unseen army that makes its home in your hair and clothing. And the rats, bold and unafraid, their scuttling feet a chilling whisper in the darkest hours. You lie down, and the rough texture of the wood or the cold dampness of the earth presses into your back. Your body aches. A deep, pervasive weariness that no amount of sleep seems to alleviate. Rain becomes a familiar sound, not a comforting patter, but a relentless drumming against the thin roof. It seeps through the gaps, drips onto your face, and slowly forms puddles on the ground where you lie. The dampness settles into your bones, a chilling constant. The stench, once noticeable, now becomes an extension of yourself, a part of your skin. It's a mix of unwashed bodies, human waste, damp earth, and the faint, sweet smell of sickness. You try to push it away, to forget it, but it clings to you, a constant reminder of your surroundings. And then, there are the deaths. They are not sudden, dramatic events, but quiet disappearances. A man you spoke to yesterday, his voice a frail thread, is now silent. You reach out a tentative hand in the dim light and find him cold. Still, there is no strength, no collective will to move the bodies immediately. They lie beside you, a silent presence, a stark reminder of the fragile line between living and dying. You close your eyes, trying to conjure a memory of a soft bed, a clean sheet, a silent room. But the images flicker and fade, replaced by the persistent dampness, the endless scratching, and the quiet, pervasive decay that has become your new home. This is where you rest, and where, slowly, you begin to unravel. The days begin and end with the quiet gnawing of hunger. It is not just a sensation in your stomach, but a deep, pervasive ache that consumes your thoughts, your dreams, and your very being. Mealtime, if it can be called that, is a solemn, ritualistic affair, a brief pause in the relentless march of your emptiness. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. The pattern is always the same: a small, often meager, portion of rice. Sometimes it's boiled until it's a watery paste. Other times a dry, chalky handful. And always, a bowl of saltwater soup. It offers little in the way of nourishment, its only purpose seemingly to fill a void, if only for a fleeting moment. The salt burns your tongue, and the warmth is fleeting, leaving you colder than before. Once a month, if you are fortunate, there might be a sliver of dried fish, its taste barely a memory of the ocean, or perhaps a spoiled root, its texture soft and fibrous, its flavor a bitter promise of fleeting sustenance. You chew slowly, deliberately, savoring each infinitesimal morsel, trying to extract every last calorie. The men around you eat in silence, their eyes fixed on their bowls, their movements precise, almost reverent. This isn't food for enjoyment. It's food for survival, a grim necessity. The hunger becomes your constant companion, a presence that never truly leaves you. It whispers to you in the long hours of the day, a subtle, rhythmic insistence. It shapes your dreams, painting vivid, agonizing landscapes of feasts. You can only imagine a roasted chicken, warm bread, fresh fruit, the sweet taste of sugar. These dreams are both a torture and a fleeting escape, a reminder of a world that feels impossibly distant. You learn the quiet desperation that hunger can bring. You have seen men, once proud and disciplined, descend into a primal scramble over a forgotten moldy crust, a discarded potato peel. The quiet dignity that once defined them melts away, replaced by a raw, guttural need. You too have found yourself doing things you swore you never would. Scavenging for scraps, for discarded bits of edible matter, ignoring the quiet warnings of your conscience. The line between what is acceptable and what is not blurs, then disappears entirely, replaced by the single, overriding imperative to simply stay alive. The taste of something rotten, something foul, becomes strangely tolerable, even desirable, if it promises a moment of satiation. Your body begins to consume itself, slowly, deliberately. You feel the sharp angles of your bones beneath your skin, the hollowness of your cheeks, the weakening of your muscles. Each movement becomes an effort, each breath a conscious act. The hunger isn't just a physical sensation. It's an erosion of your spirit, a slow, quiet diminishment of the man you once were. And yet, you continue to dream of food, a distant, tantalizing promise that keeps a faint flicker of hope alive in the desolate landscape of your existence. The quiet of pre-dawn is abruptly shattered by the piercing shriek of a whistle. It's a sound that claws its way into your shallow sleep, pulling you from the brief solace of unconsciousness. The air is still cool, sometimes damp, carrying the faint, earthy scent of the waking camp. You rise, your limbs stiff and protesting, each joint a quiet complaint. The walk to the work site is a shuffling procession of shadows, men moving with a shared, unspoken weariness. The sun has not yet climbed above the horizon, but the sky already holds a faint, anemic glow, promising the relentless heat that will soon descend. You are handed your tools, a heavy pick, its handle smooth with the sweat of countless hands, or a shovel, its metal edge dull from constant use. The work begins, a quiet, ceaseless rhythm that defines the entirety of your waking hours. You carry stone, huge, uneven boulders that seem to drain the very strength from your body with each lift. Your shoulders burn, your back screams, but you learn to push past the pain, to become a quiet vessel for the effort. You swing picks, the dull thud against the unyielding earth echoing in your ears, a constant reminder of the arduous task. You dig holes, deep, gaping wounds in the land, each scoop of soil a testament to your fading strength. You lay tracks, long, heavy sections of steel that must be wrestled into place, piece by agonizing piece. The hours stretch out, long and unyielding. 8 hours on a fortunate day. Sometimes more if the guard's mood is dark, or if the day's quota remains unmet. Time loses its meaning, blurring into a continuous cycle of exertion and exhaustion. There are no gloves to protect your hands, which become a map of blisters, calluses, and raw, weeping sores. The tools become extensions of your flesh, their rough textures a constant abrasion against your skin. No shoes, just your bare feet against the sharp stones, the hot earth, the rough gravel. Each step is a small negotiation with the pain. There is no rest. Not truly. Even the brief moments of stillness are filled with the lingering ache of your muscles, the heavy throb in your temples. You learn to conserve every ounce of energy, to move with a quiet, deliberate efficiency. The guards watch, their presence a silent, omnipresent pressure. Their eyes follow your every move, their stance unyielding. You do not look at them, but you feel their gaze, a constant, low hum of potential punishment. Sometimes, as you dig, the earth gives way to something soft, something oddly shaped. You realize, with a cold, quiet dread, that you are digging graves, and in the silent moments that follow, a chilling thought surfaces, persistent and clear, this grave, this very space you are creating, might one day be your own. The sun climbs higher, beating down with a fierce, unrelenting intensity, and you continue to move, a silent automaton, until the distant, longed-for whistle signals the temporary end of another endless day. In this place, words are often superfluous. The true language is spoken through the quick, sharp crack of a palm against flesh, the dull thud of a fist, the jarring impact of a rifle butt. It is a language you quickly learn to understand, for it is spoken frequently and without mercy. A slap to the face, a sudden, stinging blow that snaps your head back, is almost routine. It can come for no discernible reason. A sudden, arbitrary expression of power. A quiet punctuation mark in the endless monotony. You learn to brace for it, not physically, but internally, to prepare your spirit for the shock. The immediate pain is sharp, then it fades, leaving a burning shame and a lingering ache. Sometimes, it's a punch to the stomach, a sudden, breath-stealing impact that doubles you over. This might be for a perceived disrespect, a failure to bow deeply enough, or a moment of perceived insolence in your eyes. The air is driven from your lungs, leaving you gasping, your vision blurring at the edges. You learn to quickly regain your composure, to straighten your back, to lower your gaze. For any lingering sign of weakness or defiance will only invite further blows. The pain settles in your gut, a deep, bruising ache that lingers for hours, a quiet reminder of your vulnerability. Then there is the rifle butt, a heavy, unforgiving thud against your ribs, perhaps for working too slowly, for a perceived pause in your relentless effort. The impact sends a jolt through your entire body, a painful echo that resonates in your chest. You might feel a sharp, cracking sensation, or just a deep, crushing pressure. Breathing becomes shallow, each inhale a hesitant whisper, for fear of aggravating the quiet agony within. You learn to continue your work, to keep your movements fluid, even as your body screams in protest. No explanation is needed for these acts of violence. There is no trial, no justification, no attempt at reason. The blows are simply delivered, a stark, clear message of absolute control. You learn to interpret the subtle shifts in a guard's posture, the hardening of his gaze, the quiet tensing of his muscles, as precursors to the inevitable. You learn to anticipate, to react with a quiet, practiced humility. The pain is not just physical, it's a constant erosion of your spirit, a slow, deliberate dehumanization. It teaches you subservience, not through logic, but through raw, undeniable sensation. It forces you to retreat inward, to protect the fragile core of yourself from the relentless assault. Your captors speak this language fluently, effortlessly, and you, the prisoner, become a quiet student of its every nuance. The echoes of these impacts reverberate not just in your body, but in the quiet chambers of your mind, shaping your reactions, dulling your responses, slowly stripping away the man you once were. It's a dialogue of dominance, where every silence is pregnant with threat, and every sound is a reminder of your place. Beyond the routine beatings, there exists a darker, more insidious form of cruelty, one that seeks not to break the body quickly, but to unravel the mind slowly, deliberately. Torture here is not a rare, sensational event. It is a routine, a quiet, almost methodical process of chipping away at your sanity. You have stood, unmoving, for hours on end, sometimes 6 or more, until your legs become pillars of aching lead. Your joints scream in protest, and your vision blurs from the sheer effort of stillness. The sun beats down on your head, or the cold wind bites at your exposed skin. But you cannot shift, cannot fidget, cannot even blink away the stinging sweat. Every muscle in your body vibrates with exhaustion, a deep, pervasive tremor that you try desperately to suppress. The world narrows to the unbearable focus of remaining upright, of maintaining the required posture, until the boundary between your body and the unyielding ground beneath your feet seems to dissolve. You have been made to hold a bucket of water above your head, its weight deceptively light at first, then growing heavier with each passing minute. Your arms burn, a deep, searing ache that travels from your shoulders to your fingertips. Your muscles scream, vibrate, then begin to tremble uncontrollably. You know that to drop it means a beating, or worse. So you hold it, willing your arms to obey, even as they betray you, until the inevitable moment when your strength finally gives out and the water crashes down around your feet. The relief is instantaneous, followed immediately by the dull thud of the rifle butt or the sharp crack of a slap, a reminder that even in failure, there is only punishment. These acts are not about extracting information. They are about control, about demonstrating absolute power, about slowly grinding down your will. You have sat alone in the darkness, a blackness so profound it feels like a physical weight, pressing in on you. Days stretch into an endless, shapeless void without food, without water, without the comfort of a single human voice. In the quiet, the whispers begin. Your own thoughts become distorted, echoing strangely in the void. Time ceases to exist, replaced by a timeless drift. You try to conjure images of home, of loved ones, of the life you once knew, but they slip through your fingers, hazy and indistinct. You try to remember your own name, to hold on to that anchor of identity, but it feels foreign on your tongue, a word that belongs to someone else, someone distant. Because here, within these silent walls, cruelty doesn't need a reason. It is not driven by anger, or by specific information, or by a grand ideology. It simply needs time. Time to strip away your resolve. Time to fray the edges of your mind. Time to make you forget who you are. Piece by agonizing piece. You become a shadow, an echo, a quiet testament to the slow, deliberate erosion of self, until the only thing that remains is the profound, quiet silence within. The camp is not merely a place of hunger and beatings. It is a festering ground for sickness. A silent, pervasive killer that stalks the barracks with unseen hands. Here, the words doctor and medicine are mere echoes of a distant, forgotten world. There are no healers to tend to your wounds, no pills to alleviate your pain, no remedies to staunch the creeping infections. Hygiene is a cruel joke, a concept that exists only in the memories of a cleaner time. The air you breathe is thick with the accumulated effluvia of hundreds of sick bodies, a heavy, cloying scent that settles deep in your lungs. The water you drink, if you are lucky enough to get it, is often contaminated, a silent carrier of unseen threats. If a fever takes hold, its fire burning through your veins, you are met with a chilling indifference. The advice, delivered with a detached shrug, is simply to lie down and sweat it out. You retreat to your small space on the rotting wood or damp earth, your body shaking with chills, then burning with an internal heat that seems to consume you from within. Your skin feels stretched and tight. Your head throbs with a dull, persistent ache. Every movement is an agony. Every breath a shallow struggle. The days and nights blur into a feverish haze, punctuated by brief moments of lucidity where you are intensely aware of the quiet suffering around you. You watch, with a detached horror, as your body slowly, inexorably, wastes away. The weight falls off you rapidly, pounds upon pounds melting away like snow in the relentless sun. Your uniform, once tight, now hangs loosely on your skeletal frame. You lose half your body weight, perhaps even more, until you are a mere shadow of your former self, a walking testament to the camp's slow, deliberate consumption of your very being. And then there are the diseases, insidious and relentless. Dysentery, a constant, debilitating torment that drains you of your life fluids, leaving you weak and barely able to stand. Cholera, a swift and merciless killer, sweeping through the camp with terrifying speed, leaving a trail of quiet, still bodies in its wake. Malaria, with its cyclical fevers and debilitating chills, sapping your strength, turning your days into a purgatorial cycle of heat and cold. Death, in this place, does not knock politely or announce its arrival with a dramatic flourish. Instead, it sits beside you, a silent, unseen guest at your meager dinner. It touches the man next to you, then the man after that. You watch, powerless as your friends, the men with whom you shared whispered jokes, moments of fleeting hope, and the quiet camaraderie of shared suffering, simply fade away. Their breath grows shallow, their eyes lose their light, and then they are gone, leaving only an empty space beside you. The quiet grief is a luxury you cannot afford, a weight that would crush you. You learn to steel yourself, to observe their passing with a quiet, almost clinical detachment, for to feel too deeply would be to invite your own collapse. The air itself seems heavy with the unspoken farewells, the lingering presence of those who could no longer fight. Even in the deepest shadows, the human spirit, however diminished, sometimes stirs with a flicker of defiance, the thought of escape. A desperate whisper in the darkest hours takes root in some hearts. It is a dangerous dream, a fragile hope that glows briefly before being snuffed out. You know the risks, for you have witnessed the brutal consequences. Some, driven by an unyielding need for freedom, or perhaps simply by a profound, quiet despair, tried to slip through the wire, to disappear into the vast, unknown landscape beyond the camp's oppressive reach. Their attempts were rarely successful. You remember the chilling sound of rifle shots echoing through the camp, sharp and final. Then the quiet, grim procession, the bodies of those who dared to dream, dragged back and displayed in front of everyone. Their stillness, their broken forms, served as a stark, undeniable warning. But sometimes, the punishment was even more far-reaching, a cruel, collective lesson. For every man who tried to escape, 10 others were selected at random, pulled from the ranks, and executed alongside him. They were innocent, bystanders in the grand scheme of things. But their lives were deemed forfeit, a calculated price extracted for the audacity of hope. You were made to watch, your stomach churning, your breath catching in your throat. The silence after the shots was deafening, a heavy, oppressive blanket that settled over the entire camp, teaching a lesson of fear that no words could convey. Following these grim displays, the guards would bring around a document, a piece of flimsy paper that felt heavy with unspoken threat. You were made to sign a no-escape pledge, a promise, in your own hand, that you would not attempt to flee. Your heart hammered against your ribs, a frantic drum against the silence. When your turn came, you scratched out a name, not your own, but a false one, a small, quiet act of rebellion. It was a minuscule gesture, a fragile assertion of self in a world that sought to erase you, a whisper of defiance against the overwhelming force of their control. You knew it changed nothing in their eyes. But for you, it was a moment of reclaiming a tiny sliver of agency. You returned to your quiet space, the ink still fresh on the paper, knowing that the walls of the camp, though unseen, were closing in tighter than ever before. Each dawn brought with it the fresh realization that you were still here, still trapped, still bound by the invisible threads of their power. The dream of escape, though brutally punished, still flickered in the quiet corners of some minds, a dangerous, persistent ember that refused to be extinguished. And you, knowing the price, still felt the quiet pull of that impossible, beautiful freedom. And so, the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into a timeless blur. You were not alive in the way you once understood it. You were merely not dead yet. The boundaries between these two states became thin, almost imperceptible. The vibrant, living world you once inhabited receded, replaced by this gray, monotonous existence. You stopped feeling, truly feeling, the sharp edges of joy or sorrow. Your emotions became muted, dulled by the constant struggle, the perpetual exhaustion. The rich tapestry of dreams that once filled your nights slowly unraveled, replaced by a restless, empty sleep, or nightmares of a recurring, shapeless dread. Hope, once a beacon, became a distant, unreachable star, its light too faint to guide you. The memories began to fade, like old photographs bleached by an indifferent sun. Birthdays, anniversaries, the names of distant relatives, even the familiar streets of your hometown, they slipped away, replaced by the immediate, brutal realities of the camp. The past became a hazy, indistinct landscape, less real than the rough texture of the ground beneath your feet, the biting sting of hunger. But some things, the camp could not erase. The smells, the acrid scent of human waste, the cloying sweetness of gangrene, the damp earth after a rain, the stale odor of unwashed bodies. These sensory details embedded themselves deep within you, more real and enduring than any cherished memory. And the sounds, the sharp crack of a slap, the dull thud of a body hitting the ground, the quiet moans of men in pain, the distant, relentless whistles signaling the start of another endless day. These sounds became the soundtrack of your existence, forever etched into your consciousness. And the eyes? The hollow, vacant eyes of men whose spirits had long departed, even as their bodies clung to a fragile existence. Those eyes, mirroring your own quiet despair, became a haunting gallery of lost souls. If, by some miracle, you made it out, if the gates finally opened and you stepped back into the world, you would find that the camp, in its own quiet, insidious way, never truly let you go. It became a part of you, a deep, indelible scar on your soul. The silence, the hunger, the constant threat, the quiet erosion of self, these things would linger. You might walk on clean streets, eat warm food, sleep in a soft bed, but the phantom aches, the ghostly smells, the echoes of screams would remain, whispering in the quiet corners of your mind. You might search for the man you once were, the man who stepped onto that transport ship, but you would find him forever altered, forever imprinted by the quiet, brutal reality of what he endured. The world outside might beckon with promises of healing and forgetting, but the camp would always be there, a silent, unyielding presence deep within you, a part of the quiet, enduring tapestry of who you became. And sometimes, in the deepest stillness, you might hear the soft, persistent echoes of that terrible place, a faint whisper from a forgotten world, lingering like dust on your skin. By 1945, the days of Japanese conquest in the Pacific are long over, and Allied forces are advancing in the entire theater. For 2 years, U.S. Admiral Chester Nimitz's island-hopping strategy has brought the Americans ever closer to Japan. Only those islands deemed strategically significant are being besieged, while all others are simply bypassed. In November 1943, the Americans take Tarawa, followed by the Marshall Islands in February 1944 and the Marianas in June. The costly landings at Peleliu in September 1944 show just how bloody such island battles could become. U.S. commanders selected the tiny island of Iwo Jima as the next target, only 7.2 kilometers long and from 0.8 to 4 kilometers wide. It's an insignificant speck in the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. But since it's located halfway between Tokyo and U.S. air bases in the Marianas, Iwo Jima could become a vital support base for B-29 bombers, escort fighters, and search and rescue craft. Importantly, Iwo Jima is also part of the Tokyo Prefecture and is sovereign Japanese soil. The Americans hope its capture will deliver a severe psychological blow to the Japanese. The U.S. Marines' 5 Amphibious Corps, consisting of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions, is assigned the task of capturing the island, codenamed Operation Detachment. All told, 100,000 men and 700 ships will partake in a battle the Americans expect to last 5 to 10 days. Defending Iwo Jima are the 21,000 Japanese troops of the 109th Infantry Division, commanded by Lieutenant Gen Kuribayashi Tadamichi. Kuribayashi has studied the Battle of Peleliu closely and instead of holding the Marines on the beach or relying on costly banzai attacks, he plans to allow the Marines ashore and grind them down in attritional warfare on two main defensive belts. Each consists of hundreds of caves, tunnels, and expertly hidden pillboxes which the Japanese are to hold to the end. Kuribayashi's courageous battle vows. Order each of his soldiers to kill 10 invaders. The preparatory bombardment of Iwo Jima starts 3 days before D-Day, February 19th. This is much less than the 10 days requested by V Amphibious Corps Commander Major General Harry Schmidt. But as the 1st Marines move on to the 6 landing beaches at 9 a.m., Japanese resistance seems light. The biggest obstacle is a 5-meter-high terrace of volcanic ash which hinders the men and prevents their supporting LVTs from moving ashore. Just as bulldozers are brought in to make a path, Kuribayashi unleashes his artillery. It's been pre-sighted to bracket the landing beaches and pounds the Marines, inflicting heavy casualties. Now, Japanese machine guns open up from Mount Surabaki, a semi-active volcano and the highest point in the island. But the heaviest Japanese fire of all comes from the quarry on the extreme right of the landing beaches. Even before the invasion, 4th U.S. Division Commander Major General Clifton Cates had worried about it, If I knew the name of the man on the extreme right of the right-hand squad of the right-hand company of the right-hand battalion, I'd recommend him for a medal before we go in. By 11 a.m., bulldozers have cleared a path from the beaches, and the Marines begin to threaten airfield number 1. Meanwhile, the 28th Marine Regiment moves to cut off Mount Suribachi, creating a tenuous blockade. Colonel Harry Liversedge reports on conditions, troops ashore and moving to isolate volcano. Resistance moderate, but terrain awful. By the early afternoon, fighting dies down. But by the end of D-Day, only a third of the first day's objectives have been taken. The Marines capture airfield number 1, but elsewhere it's becoming clear Japanese resistance is stiffening. In the east, Marines grind up against the quarry, while the 28th moves around the base of Suribachi and its 70 reinforced concrete emplacements. Kuribayashi tries to stiffen his men's resolve. Each man should think of his defense position as his graveyard, fight until the last, and inflict much damage to the enemy. February 21st, Defiance 2 brings the Americans a new enemy, the weather. Rain and wind shut down the beaches, while kamikazes attack the U.S. naval vessels offshore and sink an escort carrier. On the island, the bloody fighting continues. In the west, the flatter terrain allows for the use of tanks, and the Americans make better progress. But against the quarry, U.S. casualties mount. One company of 240 Marines is reduced to just 18 men fit for duty. Around 300 Marines have been killed or wounded in the first 3 days. So the reserve, the 3rd Marines, is sent in ahead of schedule. Things did not improve as the rain turning Iwo Jima's volcanic sand into a sticky goo that clung to boots and fouled weapons. The 28th Marines reports bad weather and poor visibility throughout the day hampered our operations considerably. The rain mixed with volcanic dust caused stoppages in practically all automatic weapons, reducing them to single shot. Nonetheless, the Marines push ahead. The 28th now begins to scale Suribachi, while elsewhere the Marines attack Kuribayashi's main defensive belt. Kuribayashi has turned Iwo Jima into a complex network of interconnected and mutually supporting hardpoints of all shapes and sizes. Some are simple snipers' nests made from natural cracks in the rocks, while others are large reinforced blockhouses that seem impervious to even heavy artillery. The larger bunkers are well stocked with supplies and facilities. Japanese soldier Tsuji Kuza recalls, the Southern Islands Naval Air Station headquarters bunker was the largest bunker on the island, and it was rumored that it would be able to hold out for about 3 months. There were about 800 people in the bunker. there were no fewer than 500 drums filled with heavy oil, light oil, gasoline, and drinking water. With the aid of tunnels, Japanese soldiers can move around the battlefield undetected and launch their feared night attacks, which increase in frequency with each passing day. As a result, after dark American forces fire lamination shells to constantly bathe the island in light. The tunnels also allow the 800-man Japanese garrison at Suribachi to withdraw to the north just as the 28th begins its final assault on February 23rd. After meeting light resistance on the summit, Marines raised 2 U.S. flags on the mountain to signal its capture, and in doing so, they create one of the most iconic photographs of the 20th century. But the capture of Suribachi does not mean the U.S. has won the battle. The next day, U.S. forces assault Airfield No. 2, but Japanese mines and anti-tank guns prevent the use of tanks. So it's up to American infantrymen armed with grenades, flamethrowers, and small arms to lead the assault. The Japanese stubbornly hold on at the north end, and U.S. troops are only able to make serious advances in the west. Although the 4th Marines clear the quarry in the east, they now clash against the toughest enemy position yet. On D+6, the Marines in the east enter the Meat Grinder, a complex of Japanese defenses centered on 3 locations: Hill 382, Turkey Knob, and a low basin known as the Amphitheater. Defenders in these positions can mutually support each other with machine guns, artillery, and dug-in tanks. American progress slows, with advances measured in 100-yard dashes, which the men call touchdowns. The 4th Marines continue to struggle with the Meat Grinder over the coming days, while the other divisions also come up against their own hard points. On February 27th, the Americans consolidate their gains, but progress northwards is still being measured in touchdowns. The Japanese are stubbornly defending their positions, which often hold until U.S. armor assaults them from point-blank range, sometimes with Zippo Sherman flame-throwing tanks. American tankers also ram or churn their treads over cave entrances to collapse them. Japanese soldier Okoshi Harunori recalls his fears. Even if you pretended to die and fell over, on level ground, American trucks and tanks would drive over you. Some of the soldiers hid in foxholes to avoid being run over. But when the American tanks found a foxhole, they would roll around on top of it and crush the people inside. If they got you like that, you were doomed to gurgle until you died. On February 28th, which U.S. command originally expected to be the last day of the battle, victory still seems a distant prospect, with the East becoming a stalemate. Schmidt orders the 3rd Division to push in the center towards the coast, to split the Japanese defenders' last belt. With the aid of a massive artillery and air bombardment, the Marines surge forward and seize the remains of Airfield No. 2. By the next day, American forces are threatening the unfinished Airfield No. 3 while in the west. The 5th Marines now clash against Nishi Ridge, another prepared defensive position, in the east. Hill 382 is partially captured, but the Japanese on Turkey Knob and Amphitheater continue to hold out, as American casualties and exhaustion mount. More and more NCOs take command of Marine units. In some cases, privates lead their units in assaults. But just as U.S. forces are making progress in the east, the central drive bogs down. Japanese defenders on Hills 362B and C are holding up the Marines, with the summits heavily contested in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. By the following day, D+12 a stalemate sets in. Marine casualties have been extremely high so far, 3,000 dead and 13,000 wounded. The Japanese have lost 14,000, almost all dead, and only have about 7,000 men left. In the west, the Americans capture Nishi and Hill 362A and fully surround the amphitheater. As the battle continues, the Marines also begin to note deceptive Japanese tactics. Japanese snipers dressed in Marine uniforms and armed with M1s, were encountered, Also, it was discovered that the enemy was booby-trapping their dead. In anticipation of future offensives, Schmidt now orders 2 days of rest except for smaller attacks to straighten the line. Fresh American replacements arrive, but many of them have no combat experience. Airfield One sees some unusual activity today as damaged B-29 bomber Dinah might make an emergency landing. The next day's American attack is preceded by a massive artillery bombardment. The guns fire over 22,500 shells in the first hour alone. However, their impact and the advance in general is disappointing from the U.S. point of view. Fierce Japanese resistance limits the Marines to advances of only 50 to 100 meters across the whole island. It's become clear the Japanese are now well versed in the method and schedule of Marine attacks. An artillery barrage followed by infantry assault. So 3rd Division's General Graves Erskine suggests a dawn attack at 5 a.m. without artillery. Graves's troops won't advance straight ahead as previously, but into a Japanese sector facing the neighboring 4th Division. The Americans try the new method for the first time on March the 7th, and it seems to work, as by the end of the day, they take Hill 362C. This advance started to create a pocket of Japanese resistance, known as Cushman's Pocket, which continues to hold out. At midnight of the same day, senior Japanese commander Captain Inoue Samaji ignores Kuribayashi's orders and leads a 500-man banzai attack from around Tachiwa Point. He hopes to pierce the U.S. lines, destroy equipment, and even scale Suribachi to raise the Japanese flag. But the Marines' fire decimates his men, some of whom are only armed with bamboo spears or explosive vests. From range, the Americans suffer few losses. The wasteful banzai charge marks the end of major resistance in the east. Over the next 3 days, the Marines bypass Japanese hardpoints in Cushman's Pocket and finally reduce the meat grinder. In the north, a U.S. patrol reaches the sea before the Japanese push it back. Kuribayashi knows the battle is coming to a close, but he radios to Tokyo that he has no intention of surrendering. All surviving fighting units have sustained heavy losses. I am very sorry that I have let the enemy occupy one part of Japanese territory, but am taking comfort in giving him heavy damages. On D+20, Japanese resistance only exists in 3 isolated pockets: Cushman's Pocket, the eastern coast, and part of the northwest coast. Kuribayashi now falls back to a gorge, later dubbed Bloody Gorge, with his last 500 men. The Marines are exhausted, and many are incapacitated by a psychological condition they call combat fatigue, today known as PTSD. So they call on the Japanese to surrender and announce on loudspeakers that prisoners will be treated well and suicidal resistance is senseless. The Americans also distribute a translated letter from Japanese prisoner of war, Momoda Hideo comrades. I myself would never have believed that things could be this way if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. At first I was embarrassed to have been taken by the enemy, but when I learned that several officers had the same experience, I felt better. In our conversations, we agreed that it is more honorable to live for the Emperor and work for a greater Japan in the future than merely to die like rats underground. Messages like that one, though, have little impact. The Americans continue to advance and eliminate all Japanese strongpoints except for Bloody Gorge. Although U.S. authorities declare Iwo Jima secure on March 14th, Kuribayashi continues to hold out for 9 more days in a seemingly impregnable blockhouse. U.S. artillery couldn't be used for fear of friendly fire, so Marines armed with flamethrowers, grenades, and demolition explosives take on the job of reducing it. On March 23rd, Kuribayashi issued his final communication to the Japanese garrison on nearby Chichi-jima. All officers and men of Chichi-jima, goodbye from Iwo. Kuribayashi's ultimate fate is not known. It's possible that he commits suicide, or that he dies in one of the banzai attacks that become more common in the final days. On March 26th, around 200-300 Japanese troops sneak out of the Bloody Gorge and strike at Airfield No. 2, attacking mostly airmen and construction personnel. This charge, which U.S. troops quickly destroy, signals the end of the battle. It's now DPLOW 35. Marine casualties are around 23,000, including 6,800 dead, while the Navy loses about 2,800 dead and wounded. 19,000 of the 21,000 Japanese troops on the island are killed. Only 216 surrendered during the battle, and up to 2,000 continue to struggle in small groups until they are mopped up by U.S. troops. Although the later Battle of Okinawa will prove even costlier for the Americans. Iwo Jima is still the deadliest single battle for the Marines, and the only battle in the U.S. Pacific campaign where American casualties outnumber those of the Japanese. Iwo Jima is also a battle with a controversial legacy. The U.S. Army and Navy will later claim the operation was of little use, especially for the price paid. But for its intended practical purposes, it does provide immediate benefits. Through the last months of the war, two 251 B-29s make emergency landings on Iwo, potentially saving the lives of 24,000 U.S. airmen. The U.S. strategy of island hopping ever closer to Japan brings American forces within reach of the Japanese home islands in the final year of the Second World War. The next U.S. target is the Ryukyu Islands, a chain of 161 islands, of which Okinawa is the largest. U.S. planners hope that Okinawa will also provide a base for a possible invasion of Japan itself. The Japanese know that Okinawa is strategically important and have built a naval base there, in addition to 7 air bases on smaller islands nearby. Okinawa's terrain also favors the defense. The north is covered in rugged hills with deep ravines and gullies, while the somewhat flatter south has many limestone ridges and caves. There's also a large civilian population on Okinawa. 435,000 people live mostly in the south. But these people are culturally different than the Japanese. They speak the Luchuan language, and many in the Japanese garrison look on the islanders as inferior. To ensure the loyalty of the isolated locals, the Japanese authorities make heavy use of propaganda to instill fear of the Americans and unquestioning loyalty to the emperor. The fear of a potential American landing is reinforced by U.S. aerial bombing, which struck the island repeatedly from September 1944. By early 1945, much of the capital city of Naha and its port are destroyed. So the Americans are planning to invade Okinawa, while the Japanese prepare the population and the landscape for maximum resistance. Both sides view the coming battle as a battle for Japan, and commanders on both sides will closely watch the performance of their troops for insight into a potential invasion of the home islands. The defense of Okinawa is led by the Japanese 32nd Army, under Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima. There are around 100,000 troops, but their training and quality varied. The 62nd and 24th Divisions are veterans of the Chinese campaigns. Although the 24th lacks combat experience, they're supported by the understrength 44th Independent Mixed Brigade. To make up for losses, the Japanese also mobilize Air Force personnel, civilian naval staff, and Okinawan conscripts. 17,000 to 20,000 civilians form lightly armed Home Guard units, and 2,000 teenagers, some as young as 14, are organized into so-called Blood and Iron Students Corps. The Japanese don't have much in the way of heavy weapons, but they do have enough artillery and mortars. The Allies bring far more to the battlefield at Okinawa. Codenamed Operation Iceberg, 100,000 soldiers and 88,000 Marines are ready for action. Supported by 300 warships and 1130 other vessels, along with Army and Navy Air Force cover overhead. U.S. planners led by Admiral Raymond A. Spruance select a 12. 8-kilometer stretch of beach on the west coast of the island for the landings. The plan is for U.S. troops to fight their way ashore to capture the nearby Kadena and Yontan airfields. Then, they would move to the narrowest parts of the island and bottle up the Japanese, before preparing for pushes north and south. 17-year-old Japanese ammo carrier Yagisaye is overwhelmed at the sight of U.S. power. The U.S. fleet out there was just huge. The scale of the flotilla meant that the result of the battle was never in doubt. On March 29th, U.S. forces take the nearby Kerama-Reto Islands and began to bombard the Okinawa beaches with around 100,000 shells, rockets, and mortars. The invasion was about to begin, and U.S. planners expected it to be bloody. They predicted 85% casualties in the first assault waves. At 8:30 a.m. on April 1, 1945, 2 U.S. Marine and 2 U.S. Army divisions hit the beaches on Okinawa. But as they come ashore, there's only sporadic Japanese mortar and artillery fire. No machine guns, no Japanese troops. Marine Eugene Sledge, a veteran of the bloody Peleliu landings, his relieved images of the maelstrom at Peleliu had been flashing through my mind. But on Okinawa, there was practically no opposition to the landing. When we overcame our astonishment, everybody started laughing and joking. The release of the tension was unforgettable. Of the 50,000 U.S. troops who landed, only 55 are killed or missing. The light U.S. losses are part of the Japanese plan. General Ushijima decides not to contest the landings because he thinks superior U.S. firepower would wipe out his men. Instead, the Japanese plan to allow the Americans onto the island's central plains before grinding them away in attritional battles along the many ridges of southern Okinawa. Light Japanese forces will conduct harassment activities in the north, but the bulk would defend a series of lines back to the Army headquarters in Shuri Castle. Once the Americans got bogged down, Imperial headquarters promised an unprecedented air attack against the U.S. fleet. Despite Tokyo's promises, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara is pessimistic. From the very start of the Okinawa battle, we were out of real touch with Imperial headquarters. Our fighting men made cynical and sarcastic remarks, such as, "Headquarters people will never come to Okinawa," because Tsuji Town, Naha's red light district, was burned down in air raids last October. American troops advanced for several days against only token resistance by inexperienced Japanese forces. They take the airfields April 2nd, reach the east coast on the 5th, and the Chatan Isthmus in the south. The island is now split in two, but as the U.S. Marines move north and the Army south, Japanese resistance begins to stiffen. Japanese units and Okinawa irregulars begin to ambush Marines in hit-and-run attacks, especially the forested Motobu Peninsula. On April 4th, U.S. troops reached dug-in Japanese defenses, and the defenders managed to stop them at the Kakuza, Nishibaru, and Tombstone ridges in the west. Narrow passages hinder the U.S. approach. But these confined spaces also increased Japanese casualties from artillery. To inflict 450 casualties on the 96th U.S. Infantry Division, the Japanese 63rd Brigade lost around 700 men. Japanese morale does get a boost on April 12th when news of President Roosevelt's death reaches the front. But the desperate fighting continues. The Japanese are so desperate, they revert to unorthodox tactics. Colonel Kaya, famous for his ingenuity, followed the example of Masashige Kusunoki, the great 14th century warrior, and harassed the enemy by dropping human excrement on them. Despite these measures, the Americans pierced the Japanese line, but come up against new Japanese defenses along Hacksaw Ridge. Exhausted U.S. Army divisions are now being rotated out and replaced by fresher Marines. Major General Isamu Cho notices the U.S. loss of momentum and demands more aggressive counterattacks against Colonel Yahara's advice. Cho's new counterattack on May 4th is supported by amphibious landings behind American lines. But it still fails. From now on, Yahara's strategy of attrition dominates. But hope for victory is slim, Cho even said jokingly to me. "Hey, Yahara, when will it be okay for me to commit harakiri? Is this a good time?" He not only had assumed responsibility for the failed offensive, but now had lost all hope of success in any further operations. As the battle bogs down on land, another fierce struggle is fought at sea, as the Japanese Air Force attempts to wipe out the U.S. fleet. From April 6th, Japanese kamikaze pilots attack the 5th U.S. fleet continuously. The Japanese Air Force turns to the suicide tactic after reports of its success in the Philippines. Kamikaze attacks are more accurate and damaging than conventional attacks, from which few Japanese pilots return in any case. The first raid of 355 kamikazes is just the beginning. Overall, about 1,800 kamikazes attack U.S. ships and Okinawan airfields between April and June. Many are shot down, but swarming tactics increase their chances of success. As U.S. sailor J. Holmes aboard the destroyer Hadley writes later, "This was the granddaddy of them all. We didn't have time to count. But the records show the kamikazes came at us 10 at a time. As good as our gunners were, there was no way we were going to stop them all." By the end of the battle, kamikazes sink 26 U.S. ships and damage 225 more, resulting in 9,700 U.S. casualties, the highest losses for the Navy since Pearl Harbor. Kamikazes are not the only threat to American ships. On April 6th, the Japanese battleship Yamato, the biggest in the world, heads for Okinawa. It only has enough fuel for a one-way trip, and the plan is for the vessel to beach itself on the island and use its massive guns in support of the defenders. But U.S. forces spot it halfway to Okinawa, and American bombers and torpedo bombers sink the Yamato with 3,000 of her crew. Back on deadlocked Okinawa, U.S. forces regroup in late May and assault the toughest Japanese positions yet. To make matters worse, it rains almost incessantly. U.S. troops move to outflank the Japanese strongpoint of Shuri, but the defenders in the center hold on. Fierce fighting takes place around Sugarloaf and Horseshoe Hills in the west, while Army troops tackle Conical Hill in the east. Japanese defenders, often on reverse slopes, are able to inflict heavy casualties on U.S. troops. As the weather worsens, the U.S. advance slows again. The rain bothers both sides, but is particularly troublesome for the vehicle-dependent Americans. Sledge describes the desolate approach to Shuri. "It was the most ghastly corner of hell I had ever witnessed. As far as I could see, an area that previously had been a low grassy valley with a picturesque stream meandering through, it was a muddy, repulsive, open sore on the land. Every crater was half full of water, and many of them held a marine corpse. The bodies lay pathetically just as they had been killed, half submerged in muck and water, rusting weapons still in hand. The short ranges of the battles favor Japanese defenders and limit U.S. artillery. In response, U.S. troops use flamethrower tanks, satchel charges, and napalm to burn out defenders and collapse caves. In late May, the Japanese eastern flank collapses and the Americans take Naha. The Japanese attempt an airborne attack on May 25th, but U.S. forces destroy it immediately. The Japanese are in danger of being surrounded, so they withdraw further south on May 29th. By this point, roughly 6,500 Japanese and 5,300 U.S. troops have been killed. As the Japanese army withdraws, it takes civilians with it, while Home Guard units are ordered to delay the U.S. pursuit. Okinawa's civilians play a unique role and suffer greatly during the battle on their island. During the battle, The Japanese partially evacuate the island and encourage civilians to flee the combat areas. Many civilians, however, choose to remain close to Japanese troops, while the army press gangs others as laborers, nurses, and sex slaves known as comfort girls. Because the Japanese make such intense use of propaganda, some Okinawans take their own lives rather than face the expected American brutality. At least 30 groups and families killed themselves en masse, often overseen by the Japanese military. Up to 700 civilians killed themselves on Karamaretto alone. U.S. soldier Corporal Dan Lawler recalls Okinawan fears. "We gave them all some candy, but they still refused to touch it unless one of us ate some of it first. You could tell they didn't trust us as far as they could throw us." Civilian fears of U.S. troops are compounded by the fact many Marines are not used to fighting around civilians. Their shoot first, ask questions later mentality means they frequently kill families hiding in caves and shoot some others as suspected infiltrators. The Japanese army even uses civilians like teenager Oshiro Kenki to cover its own retreat and conduct suicide attacks. We had no idea where the Japanese army was. They had simply abandoned our student group. We were simply given hand grenades and told not to throw them until we could see the whites of the Americans' eyes. By early June, the Japanese situation is desperate. About 30,000 troops remain, many of them wounded. The survivors retreat to the Kion Peninsula and prepare for a last stand. On June 4th, Marines conduct a shore-to-shore landing and attack the Japanese naval base on Oroku. With exhaustion and cases of combat fatigue increasing, U.S. commanders try to convince the Japanese to surrender in vain. Close quarters fighting erupts around Kunishi Ridge, with the Japanese scoring a late success on the 18th. They managed to kill 10th U.S. Army Commander Lieutenant General Buckner. But the battle is now all but decided. By June 21st, U.S. tanks are converging on the Japanese 32nd Army headquarters. Ushijima orders a suicide charge out of the headquarters, which he intends to watch as he commits ritual suicide. Many other Japanese officers also resort to suicide charges as communications break down. Finally, in the early hours of June 23rd, Ushijima and a heavily intoxicated Cho kill themselves. Cho writes a poem before his death. "The devil foe tightly grips our southwest land. His aircraft fill the sky. His ships control the seas. Bravely we fought for 90 days inside a dream. We have used up our withered lives, but our souls race to heaven." Other than a few isolated holdouts, the Battle of Okinawa mostly ends on June 22, 1945. The battle is one of the deadliest for the U.S. military in World War II. 3,000 Marines, 4,000 to 600 Army soldiers, and 4,900 sailors are killed. Of the 100,000 Japanese troops, 66,000 are killed and half of all survivors wounded. Estimates on civilian deaths vary, but some range as high as 140,000, one-third of the indigenous population. Despite the huge casualties, the Japanese strategy is one of their most effective of the war. It grinds down U.S. resources and morale, with many veteran soldiers now psychologically exhausted. The 82-day battle also gives a glimpse of what might be expected in a fight for the Japanese home islands. With a mobilized civilian population fighting in familiar territory with prepared positions and suicidal fanaticism, U.S. planners apply the so-called Okinawa rate to estimate potential losses in an invasion of Japan. They expected up to 1 million U.S. killed and wounded. At the same time, President Harry Truman receives reports that some Japanese politicians might be willing to surrender, and that powerful new atomic bombs will soon be available. Historians still debate the full consequences of the Okinawa battle, but some argue the bloody toll of the Okinawa operation plays a part in persuading Truman to use atomic weapons barely a month later. The bombs could be used as an alternative to a bloody invasion of the Japanese home islands. Since 1943, the U.S. military had been drawing up plans for such an invasion, which would take place in two phases. Allied troops would land at Kyushu on November 1, 1945, then capture the Tokyo plain in March 1946. The Japanese Ketsugo defense plan was not to defeat the invasion, but to inflict enough losses on the Americans so Japan could get better peace terms. The Americans knew the Japanese were preparing and expected to face 4.5 million Japanese troops in Japan, with 625,000 in Kyushu alone. U.S. planners used this intelligence about Japanese troop numbers and the known casualty rates from Iwo Jima and Okinawa to estimate potential losses for a full invasion. By August 1945, they expected between 250,000, 1 million killed and wounded. It is often suggested the expectation of casualties encouraged U.S. leaders to seek alternatives to an invasion, including the atomic bombs. But recent research suggests that the casualty estimates were probably exaggerated. Planners had no reliable methodology to use. U.S. intelligence didn't recognize the poor quality of Japanese units, and unlike at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the battlefield would be larger, enabling units to avoid fire, maneuver, and withdraw if necessary. One more recent estimate by historian Rufus Miles suggests around 20,000 U.S. deaths in the battle for Japan's home islands, more than Iwo Jima and Okinawa combined, but less than 1945 estimations. Regardless, some historians maintain it was the expectation of casualties at the time that mattered. The atomic bombs, tested successfully in July 1945, provided Truman with a way to avoid a potential slaughter right at the end of the war. On receiving news of the atomic bomb test success, Truman wrote to his wife, "I'll say that we'll end the war a year sooner now, and think of the kids who won't be killed." But the bombings were not the only important events to impact the Japanese. In early August, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Japanese-held Manchuria. Defeat for Japan was now coming from multiple angles. Few events of the Second World War have triggered more historical debate than those of August 1945. Historians have long argued whether the atomic bombs were necessary and which factors were most important in causing the Japanese to surrender. The conventional view, supported by Orthodox historians, mostly follows the mainstream post-war American perspective, that the bombs were the decisive factor in the Japanese surrender. But other historians have argued a different view, that the intervention of the Soviet Union in the Pacific War on August 9, 1945, the same day as the Nagasaki bombing, actually triggered the Japanese surrender and arguably made the bombs unnecessary. This view is often called revisionist, since it revises or changes the older Orthodox argument. Evolving arguments are a normal part of historians' work in trying to explain the past. And there are differences within the Orthodox and revisionist schools of thought on the bomb. So these labels are a bit simplified to help us get to the core of the issue. First, let's take a step back and establish the facts. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany unconditionally surrendered to Allied and Soviet forces. In July, the victors met at the Potsdam Conference near Berlin. Near the top of the agenda was the ongoing war against Japan, in which the USSR was still neutral. At Potsdam, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin confirmed his 1943 promise to the Brits and Americans that he would join the war against Japan in exchange for Soviet influence in Manchuria, plus South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. He also revealed the Japanese had approached Moscow with informal peace feelers since 1943. By 1945, it was clear they wanted to use the neutral USSR as a mediator to end the war on better terms. Now remember, testing vague peace ideas with a potential mediator country is not the same as being willing to surrender. All the while, Japan's military was preparing the home islands for defense and blocked any serious peace efforts by politicians. Even Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, who favored peace, did not want it at any price. Meanwhile, at Potsdam, U.S. President Harry Truman received a short telegram from the U.S. on July 16th, operated on this morning. Diagnosis not yet completed, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations. This message meant that the first atomic weapons test in New Mexico had been a success. On July 24th, Truman casually informed Stalin of a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin, equally casually, suggested good use of the bomb could be made against Japan. On July 26th, the Allies issued the Potsdam Proclamation, but the USSR didn't sign. They called on Japan to surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese government was divided on how to respond. Emperor Hirohito was head of state, but the country was actually governed by the so-called Big Six cabinet ministers. 3 ministers wanted to ask the Allies for clarification, while the other 3, all military, wanted to reject the proclamation. In the end, the cabinet simply ignored it. But they could not ignore what happened next. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6th, a B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb over Hiroshima. It exploded 600 meters above the city, causing ground temperatures to reach 4,000 degrees centigrade. Nearly everyone within 1 km was killed instantly, and those within a 3 to 5 km radius were terribly burned. High school student Yamaoka Michiko recalled the moment of the explosion. There was no sound. I felt something strong. It was terribly intense. I felt colors. It wasn't heat. You can't really say it was yellow, and it wasn't blue. I thought I would be the only one to die. I said to myself, "Goodbye, Mom." The bomb destroyed 70,000 of Hiroshima's 76,000 buildings and killed up to 110,000 people. The White House released a statement. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. So the bomb had been dropped and Hiroshima destroyed. At the same time, Japan's leaders were discussing surrender. The initial Japanese response to the American threat to drop more bombs was to delay. Military ministers blocked a planned cabinet meeting, but Japanese diplomats did quickly meet with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. When the Japanese ambassador met Molotov on August 8th to discuss peace, the Soviet diplomat instead handed him a declaration of war. The next day. 1. 5 million Soviet troops invaded Japanese-occupied Manchuria, crushing Japan's Kwantung Army. The Japanese cabinet finally met, but couldn't agree on what to do. Civilian ministers wanted to surrender on the condition the emperor could remain, while most military ministers demanded no occupation, voluntary disarmament of Japanese forces, and Japanese-controlled war crime trials. While they discussed, the second atomic bomb hit Nagasaki, killing 40,000. The emperor himself now intervened with an unprecedented scared decision to surrender with one condition: his own retention as monarch. The Japanese sent these terms to the Americans on August 10th, and the U.S. didn't refuse, but didn't accept either. They simply repeated that the Japanese people would choose their own government. on August 15th, after a badly organized military coup by junior officers failed. Hirohito announced that Japan would surrender unconditionally. Fighting in Manchuria stopped on August 16th, and the war formally came to an end, September 2nd, 1945. Truman was also under public pressure to end the war soon with minimal losses, while simultaneously not letting Japan off lightly. The bombs ticked both these boxes. After the bombings, opinion polls showed 85 or 75% of Americans supported their use, and 23% wanted to drop more. But the atomic bombs were not guaranteed to work. And for this reason, some Orthodox historians say Truman still wanted Soviet help. Revisionist historians, on the other hand, claim Soviet intervention became Truman's worst-case scenario. For revisionists, the atomic bombings had more to do with containing the Soviet Union than defeating Japan. The dropping of the atomic bombs was not so much the last military act of the Second World War as the first major operation of the Cold War with Russia. They argue that although Truman wanted Soviet assistance before Potsdam, he changed his mind. Revisionists highlight that Stalin never received an official invitation to join the war. Instead, they suggest Truman wanted an insurance policy in case the bombs did not work. Stalin provided this by confirming Operation August Storm would start on August 15th. Once Truman had reliable data from the bomb test success on July 21st, revisionists claim Truman drastically shifted his position to ending the war before the August 15th Soviet offensive could begin. This led the revisionists to conclude that Truman and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill saw a chance to limit Soviet influence and prevent the USSR from getting the Japanese islands and influence in northern China they had been promised. Some in the US government worried that the Soviets couldn't be trusted to respect an agreement, especially on the question of free elections in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, any deal involving China still needed to be run past Chiang Kai-shek. Truman himself wrote his opinion in his memoirs. I was not willing to let Russia reap the fruits of a long and bitter and gallant effort in which she had had no part. Revisionists also suggest that, far from offering Japan an opportunity to surrender, the Potsdam Proclamation was deliberately designed to be unacceptable, thereby justifying use of the bombs. Several members of the U.S. delegation, like Stimson, wanted to adjust the unconditional surrender demand to guarantee the emperor, but he was overruled by the Joint Chief of Staffs and Burns. But when the U.S. dropped the Hiroshima bomb, revisionists argue that instead of intimidating the Soviets, it actually spurred them on. Stalin knew about the bomb program thanks to his spies, but the test was a surprise, apparently outraged. He brought forward the invasion date to August 9th. So the orthodox argument that the bombs were dropped to save lives has been questioned by revisionists who argued it was primarily to prevent Soviet gains in Asia. A minority of revisionists have even argued that the U.S. dropped the bombs partly out of grim scientific curiosity or to justify the expense of developing them. But the evidence for this is weaker. That said, Orthodox and revisionist schools also disagree about another critical question: why exactly did Japan surrender? Orthodox historians suggest that Japan would fight on if it felt its defensive plan to kill as many Allied troops as possible had a chance of working. The bombs, though, weakened Japanese belief that determined defense and Soviet mediation might end the war on better terms. According to this line of thought, Japanese leaders now accepted their country could be bombed into submission, especially if the U.S. was going to drop more atomic bombs after the first two. Maybe they would even drop one on Tokyo. In reality, Truman planned to scale back bombings after Nagasaki and Tokyo was never an atomic target. But the Japanese didn't know this. Their fears, Orthodox historians claim, were increased by the shock of the atomic bombs, since Japanese scientists had theorized but were nowhere near developing them. Japan's leaders also considered the atomic bombs a critical threat to Japanese civilians. Orthodox historians have pointed to evidence like this statement from Hirohito to a close advisor. Now that things have come to this impasse, we must bow to the inevitable. No matter what happens to my safety, we should lose no time in ending the war so as not to have another tragedy like this. Orthodox historians also say the Soviet attack was not all that important in Japan's decision to capitulate. Japanese leaders knew a Soviet offensive was possible, so its shock impact was minimal. One piece of evidence on this point is a statement by Deputy Army Chief Torashiro Kawabe. Although we have long worried about the question of Soviet entry, a surprise attack with this new atomic weapon was beyond our wildest dreams. In the Orthodox argument, the Soviet attack was concerning to the Japanese, but not a critical threat to the home islands or the Keitsugo plan. In any case, Japan expected to lose Manchuria in a peace deal anyway. So the Orthodox position is that Japan surrendered because of the destruction of the atomic bombs and potential for more of the same. The revisionist approach, though, sees it very differently. They suggest the impact of the bombs has been exaggerated since the war, while the impact of the Soviet invasion has been minimized. Firstly, revisionists argue the destruction from the atomic bombs was not so different from the impact of conventional U.S. bombing. On March 9th, a U.S. raid on Tokyo killed 84,000 people, more than the lower estimates for Hiroshima and more than the immediate death toll at Nagasaki. In any case, most Japanese cities were already destroyed by the time the atomic bombs were invented. Historian Robert Pape put it this way: if one defines the hostage as major and secondary cities with over 100,000 people, then the hostage was nearly dead before the atomic bombs fell. After the war, a U.S. strategic bombing survey estimated the atomic bomb did as much damage as 210 conventional bomber sorties. In August 1945, Kakwan Bomber Command was flying 200 sorties a week. Revisionists claim this reduced the shock of the atomic bomb, since the Japanese leadership already expected mass death from more conventional bombing or an invasion. The Japanese military didn't really react much to the first atomic bomb, and even doubted an atomic weapon had been used at all. That's why they said they had more important things to do than attend the cabinet meeting on August 8th. According to the revisionists, the atomic bombings did not encourage surrender and instead reinforced the Japanese plan to defend the home islands and seek Soviet mediation. In fact, Japanese generals reasoned atomic bombs wouldn't be much use during an invasion. The most important reason Japan abandoned the plan to fight to the end, in revisionist eyes, was the Soviet declaration of war. The atomic bombs created confusion at the top, but the Soviet attack was the realization of the worst-case scenario. Once the Soviets declared war, all hope for mediation via the USSR was gone. Although somewhat anticipated, revisionists suggest this resulted in an even bigger shock than the bomb. One piece of evidence for this is General Kawabe's post-war statement. Since Tokyo was not directly affected by the bombing, the full force of the shock was not felt. In comparison, the Soviet entry into the war was a great shock when it actually came. It gave us all the more severe shock and alarm because we had been in constant fear that the vast Red Army forces in Europe were now being turned against us. Kawabe is a prime example of how isolated statements from leading figures can be contradictory. In the previous section of this video, his words are used to support the orthodox position. Tokyo also worried the Soviet involvement might trigger communist uprisings in Japan, which might end the imperial dynasty for good. Revisionists argue that this is what convinced even the military to accept the Potsdam Proclamation. For revisionist historians, the opinions of the military leaders of the Big Six are particularly important. They were the strongest faction within the cabinet and had previously vetoed peace overtures. But after the Soviet invasion, revisionists say even the military leaders decided to surrender, although they still debated its exact terms. The senior officers accepted Hirohito's sacred decision and never launched a full-scale military coup. Revisionists also claim that Hirohito was not motivated to save civilian lives, since he didn't do anything to stop the deaths from conventional strategic bombing, and that his real priority was saving his family's imperial regalia and shrines from invasion or communist revolution. So the orthodox thinking is that the bombs forced the Japanese to surrender, while the revisionists argue it was the Soviet intervention. All these discussions have led historians to wonder whether the US might have forced Japan to surrender a different way, without the bombs at all. One of the most debated what-ifs is the idea that Japan was likely to surrender before a US invasion took place. Revisionists have floated the possibility that if the Allies had guaranteed the emperor in the Potsdam Proclamation, the Japanese would have given up sooner. Even the U.S. War Department Operation Division recognized the importance of the emperor. The primary intention in issuing the proclamation is to induce Japan's surrender and thus avoid the heavy casualties implied in a fight to the finish. It is almost universally accepted that the basic point on which the acceptance of surrender terms will hinge lies in the question of the disposition of the emperor and his dynasty. Therefore, from the military point of view, it seems necessary to state unequivocally what we intend to do with regard to the emperor. Revisionists maintain that the U.S. failure to heed this advice and the dropping of the bombs probably delayed the end of the war. They also raise other possibilities that might have led to Japanese surrender instead of the bombs, like keeping up the naval blockade or conventional bombing. Some even think that a Soviet invasion of the island of Hokkaido would have put an immediate stop to the war as well. As you can imagine, Orthodox historians have energetically criticized these points. They say if the U.S. guaranteed the emperor, the Japanese might have interpreted it as a sign of weak resolve and kept them fighting. Important government figures in Japan gave no indication they would consider surrender before August, despite the already devastating effects of strategic bombing and the blockade. Historian Richard Frank is unequivocal. In the face of this evidence, it is fantasy, not history, to believe that the end of the war was at hand before the use of the atomic bomb. Orthodox arguments also point to the high death rates that further strategic bombing, starvation blockade, or a Soviet invasion would have caused, perhaps taking more lives than the bombs did, even without a U.S. invasion, including amongst peoples under Japanese occupation. An additional argument is that the bombs actually gave Japan a justification for surrender. Chief Cabinet Secretary Hisatsune Sakamitsu's post-war thoughts provide some evidence for this. The atomic bomb was a golden opportunity given by heaven for Japan to end the war. There were those who said that the Japanese armed forces were not defeated. It was in science that Japan was defeated. So the military will not bring shame on themselves by surrendering. The orthodox versus revisionist argument is further complicated by tricky historical sources too. There is a lack of fully reliable primary sources for August 1945, and many of the letters or diaries written at the time are incomplete or contradictory. Post-war memoirs are also problematic, since many decision-makers tried to put themselves in a good light in the new environment of the Cold War or war crimes trials. Evidence obtained from post-war U.S. interrogations has also been questioned. Aside from sources, the whole debate relies on the assumption that a single person or unit was responsible for important decision-making. In reality, such complex decisions are the result of networks of people, power struggles, attitudes, institutions, and personalities that can also change their position over time. Did the U.S. drop the atomic bombs to avoid a costly invasion, or to limit Soviet influence in Asia? Did Japan surrender because of the bombs, or because of the Soviet declaration of war? Did the bombs ultimately save lives, or could more people have lived if they had not been dropped? Even today, almost 80 years later, the debates around the end of the Second World War are just as heated and explosive as ever. The Soviet declaration of war against Japan, which may have been the main factor in Japan's surrender, was only possible because Nazi Germany had already been defeated in Europe. From Operation Dragoon. In early 1945, the Allies set their eyes on the Rhine in western Germany, and the Red Army was gearing up for their Berlin operation. The Battle of the Rhineland would be the last set-piece battle in the West, and the Battle of Berlin, the last one in the East. Millions of Allied soldiers stood at the ready to bring the Third Reich to its knees, and the last German reserves would have to defend. If you are curious about these two battles, we produced 2 World War II documentary series that together run for more than 8 hours. In Rhineland 45, we cover the battle for the Lower Rhine, from the Reichswald at the border until the Allied crossing of the Rhine, that involved the biggest single-day paratrooper landing of the entire war. In 16 days in Berlin, we document the entire 2-week Battle of Berlin day by day. Both documentary series were filmed on original location, feature expert guests like Ian from Forgotten Weapons or David Willey from the Tank Museum. And they show the Second World War in an uncompromising way that wouldn't be possible to show on YouTube. So where can you watch 16 Days in Berlin and Rhineland 45?